The security guard rolled his eyes as the old man shuffled forward with his cane, jacket hanging loose on his shrinking frame. "Sir, you gonna make it through today?" the guard asked with obvious impatience. The man didn't answer, just kept moving, at his own careful pace. But his son stepped forward, voice steady as steel. "That's Lieutenant Colonel Weller. He flew Apaches in Fallujah." The entire security checkpoint went quiet, because what looked like weakness was just the weight of years spent carrying fire through hostile skies. Hit that subscribe button if you believe our heroes deserve recognition before they have to earn it twice. Lieutenant Colonel David Weller had weathered 67 years on this earth, and 22 of them strapped into the cockpit of an AH-64 Apache helicopter, accumulating over 300 to 200 flight hours in some of the most dangerous airspace on the planet. This Tuesday morning at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport felt like one of his harder landings, though he'd certainly had worse. His worn leather jacket hung looser now than it had during his active duty years, the fabric soft from decades of wear, but still bearing the ghost outline of where his wings had once been pinned, the same wings he'd earned after graduating flight school third in his class at Fort Rucker, Alabama, back when the Apache was still considered experimental technology. The walking cane in his right hand wasn't an accessory or a fashion statement. It was a necessity earned through a particularly brutal hard landing outside Fallujah during Operation Iraqi Freedom, when his Apache took small arms fire during a convoy escort mission. He'd been flying overwatch for a supply convoy carrying medical supplies to a forward operating base when insurgents opened up from 3 different positions, using the convoy as bait to draw in air support. David had spotted the muzzle flashes from concealed fighting positions that ground forces couldn't see, marked the targets with his co-pilot gunner, and was coordinating the attack when an RPG detonated close enough to his aircraft to crack the cockpit glass and send metal fragments through the engine compartment. The Apache could take punishment that would drop other aircraft. But even the most advanced attack helicopter has limits when physics meets explosives. David had managed to keep the bird in the air long enough to complete the gun runs that broke up the ambush, but the landing back at base came down harder than physics usually allows, compressing 3 vertebrae in his lower spine and ending his flying career with the kind of injury that shows up on X-rays decades later, as a reminder that some prices get paid in installments. The spinal compression fractures from that day had healed about as well as military medicine could manage, but they'd left him with a permanent reminder that some landings you walk away from and some landings you limp away from, and you're grateful for either one. David had never complained about the cane, never applied for disability benefits he was entitled to, never made a fuss about the constant ache that flared up whenever the weather changed. He'd learned long ago that some burdens you carry quietly, and the weight of them becomes part of who you are. His son Ethan walked beside him through the terminal, early 30s, with the kind of restless energy that comes from watching your father move through the world at half the speed you remember from childhood. Ethan had grown up on army bases around the world. Fort Hood, Fort Bragg, a 2-year stint in Germany, where David had served as a training instructor for NATO pilots learning Apache systems. He'd spent his teenage years listening to the distant thunder of Apaches practicing night flights, watching his dad come home from deployments with new lines around his eyes and stories he'd never tell. There had been phone calls that ended abruptly when Ethan walked into the room, hushed conversations between his parents about missions that couldn't be discussed at the dinner table, and that particular tension that filled military families. When news reports mentioned casualties in places where Dad was currently deployed, Ethan had learned early that his father's job involved more than just flying helicopters. He'd seen the stress lines that appeared around David's eyes after particularly difficult missions, had noticed how his dad would sometimes sit quietly on the back porch for hours after returning from deployment, staring at nothing while working through memories that civilian life had no context for understanding. Now they were traveling together to a veterans conference in Phoenix, where David had reluctantly agreed to speak on a panel about aviation medicine and combat stress management, though he'd made Ethan promise to keep him from saying anything that might sound like bragging or self-promotion. "I fix helicopters and teach people how to fly them," David always said when people asked about his military service. Nothing more complicated than that. But Ethan had heard the stories from other pilots who'd served with his father, had seen the letters from ground troops whose lives David had saved, had quietly read through his dad's personnel file one afternoon when he was helping him organize his retirement paperwork. The citations and commendations painted a picture of a pilot who'd flown missions that other aviators considered suicidal, who'd volunteered for the most dangerous assignments because he understood that someone had to do them, and he trusted his own skills more than he trusted anyone else's luck. The morning light filtering through the airport's massive windows cast everything in that particular grayish hue that makes travelers look tired before they've even started their journey. David moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned that rushing leads to mistakes, and mistakes in an Apache cockpit could cost lives. His gray hair was still cut in a military short style, more from habit than regulation, and his bearing remained straight despite the cane. Shoulders back, eyes forward, every step measured and purposeful. The airport bustled around them with the controlled chaos of modern air travel, announcements echoing from overhead speakers in 3 languages, the constant hum of conversation punctuated by the mechanical whir of moving walkways and the distant roar of jet engines spooling up. On the tarmac, they approached the security checkpoint during the morning rush, when business travelers moved with the aggressive efficiency of people who believed their time was more valuable than everyone else's. David got in line behind a young executive who kept checking his watch and sighing dramatically, ahead of a family with 3 small children who were already melting down before they'd even reached the metal detectors. A college student with oversized headphones bobbed his head to music no one else could hear, while an elderly woman in a wheelchair waited patiently as her daughter argued with a gate agent about boarding procedures. The familiar chaos of airport security stretched ahead of them, shoes coming off, laptops being pulled from bags, the constant background noise of instructions being shouted over the general din of stressed travelers trying to catch flights to places they'd rather not be going. The TSA checkpoint was operated by Secure Air Solutions, a private contractor company whose guards wore uniforms designed to look more official than they actually were. Their patches bore an eagle logo that was trying very hard to suggest federal authority without actually claiming it, and their attitude suggested they'd absorbed the worst aspects of government bureaucracy without gaining any of the competence that sometimes came with actual training. The guards were mostly young, mostly tired, mostly counting down the hours until their shifts ended, and they could go home to apartments they couldn't quite afford on security wages that barely covered rent and student loan payments. They'd seen thousands of passengers that month, processed them like items on a conveyor belt, and developed the particular brand of customer service cynicism that comes from dealing with people at their most stressed and inconvenienced. David's military ID triggered the computer system's secondary screening protocol, a random algorithm that selected certain passengers for additional scrutiny, regardless of their background or threat level. The supervisor, a man in his 40s named Brad Mitchell, who'd been working airport security for 8 years and still felt the need to prove his authority, approached with the swagger of someone who believed a uniform and a badge made him important. Mitchell had never served in the military himself, had in fact been rejected from both the army and the police force for psychological evaluations that suggested he enjoyed authority a little too much for positions that required judgment and restraint. His rejection from military service had come during the height of the Iraq War, when recruitment standards were at their lowest and the army was taking almost anyone who could pass basic training. The fact that even a desperate military had found him unsuitable for service was a wound that had never properly healed, festering into the kind of resentment that expressed itself through petty exercises of power over people who couldn't fight back. Mitchell had started at Secure Air as a basic screener, working his way up through seniority rather than competence, accumulating authority without wisdom and responsibility without accountability. He'd developed a particular dislike for elderly passengers who moved slowly through his checkpoint, especially those who carried themselves with the kind of quiet confidence that reminded him of the drill sergeants who dismissed him from basic training. Military bearing irritated him because it represented something he'd been denied access to, a brotherhood he'd been judged unworthy to join. When he saw older men with that particular posture, straight spine, measured movements, eyes that had seen things he could only imagine, Mitchell felt compelled to remind them that in his domain, their past accomplishments meant nothing. "Sir, you've been selected for additional screening," Mitchell announced, with the kind of officiousness that small men use when they want to feel bigger. "I'm going to need you to step over here and place all your belongings in these bins." David nodded and began the slow process of removing his jacket, his belt, his shoes, each movement careful and deliberate, his spine protesting with every bend and twist. The cane went into a separate bin for individual screening, leaving David to stand unsteadily on the worn carpet, one hand braced against the stainless steel table for support. That's when Mitchell made his first mistake. "Maybe next time take the escalator instead of the stairs, Grandpa," he said to one of his colleagues, voice pitched just loud enough for David and Ethan to hear. The comment drew a chuckle from a younger guard who was still learning that mockery was easier than empathy, still believing that age was something that happened to other people, still young enough to think that walking with a cane was a choice rather than a consequence. Ethan felt his jaw clench, his hands forming fists inside the pockets of his jacket. But he caught his father's eye and saw the almost imperceptible shake. "Of the head that meant not worth it, son." David had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, that dignity came from how you carried yourself through difficult moments rather than how you responded to small-minded people. He'd dealt with worse than airport security guards, had been shot at by people who actually meant to kill him, and he wasn't about to let some contractor with a badge ruin his morning. The metal detector beeped when David shuffled through it, his belt buckle setting off the sensitive equipment. "Sir, I need you to walk back through and try again," Mitchell called out, making no effort to hide his impatience. David turned around slowly, the movement obviously painful, and walked back. Through the detector, it beeped again. "One more time, sir, and this time don't lean on anything." David made the walk a third time, his face showing no emotion despite the obvious discomfort, the beeping sound echoing through the checkpoint like an accusation. "Sir, I'm going to need you to walk without the cane for a moment," Mitchell announced, loud enough for other passengers to turn and stare. "Just step through one more time, hands at your sides, no assistance." The request was technically within security protocols, but the way Mitchell delivered it, with that particular tone that suggested David was being deliberately difficult, transformed a routine procedure into something that felt like public humiliation. David stood straighter, meeting Mitchell's eyes with the steady gaze he'd once used to communicate with his crew during combat missions. "I can't do that," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades giving orders and following them. "This cane isn't decorative. I need it to walk." Mitchell stepped closer, his voice taking on that aggressive edge that insecure people use when they feel their authority being questioned. "Well, sir, then maybe you shouldn't be flying at all if you can't follow simple security procedures." The words hit the checkpoint like a physical blow, drawing gasps from nearby passengers and causing the other security guards to look up from their stations. Even by airport security standards, the comment crossed a line that separated routine rudeness from deliberate cruelty. That's when Ethan stepped forward, his voice shaking with barely controlled anger as he spoke into the sudden silence that had fallen over the entire checkpoint. "You want to know why he can't walk without that cane?" he asked, his words carrying clearly through the terminal space. "Because he flew Apache helicopters with a broken back, took a hit in Fallujah while saving Marines pinned down by enemy fire. You ever been shot at while trying to save someone else's life?" The question hung in the air like smoke, transforming the atmosphere in the checkpoint from routine processing to something approaching reverence. Other passengers stopped what they were doing, turning to look at the old man with the cane, who suddenly seemed to stand taller despite his obvious physical limitations. A woman with a baby adjusted her position to get a better look. A businessman lowered his phone and actually made eye contact with David for the first time since they'd been standing in line together. From somewhere near the back of the security line, an older man in a baseball cap slowly removed his hat and held it against his chest. His voice, when he spoke, carried the particular gravity that comes from shared experience and earned respect. "Did you say Weller?" "Colonel David Weller." The man pushed through the crowd with the determined movement of someone on a mission, ignoring the protests of other passengers as he made his way to the front of the line. His cap bore the patch of the 3rd Infantry Division, and his weathered hands showed the calluses of someone who'd spent years maintaining military equipment in desert conditions. "Sergeant First Class Mike Torres, 3rd Infantry Division," the man said, extending his hand toward David with the formal precision of a military introduction. "You pulled my squad out of hell outside Ramadi in 05. We were pinned down for 3 hours, convoy burning, nowhere to go. You came in so low I could see your face through the cockpit window, stayed on station until every last one of my boys made it to the LZ." Torres's voice carried the weight of memory that 8 years hadn't diminished. The smell of burning diesel fuel, the sound of incoming mortars, the relief of hearing Apache rotors overhead when all hope seemed lost. "You took fire for 20 minutes, Torres continued, his eyes never leaving David's face. "Drew every shooter in that sector onto your bird while the rescue chopper got us out. We counted 14 different impact marks on your aircraft when you landed back at base. 14 holes, and you still kept flying." He paused, gathering himself. "I wrote letters to my kids about that night, about what real courage looks like when everything goes wrong and someone still chooses to do the right thing." David shook the offered hand, his expression showing recognition despite the years that had passed since that night mission. "Torres. Good to see you made it home, Sergeant. How's Corporal Jenkins? He took that shrapnel in his leg during the extraction." The question revealed the kind of detailed memory that combat veterans develop for moments that matter. The ability to recall not just the big picture, but the individual faces and specific injuries that made each mission personal rather than just professional. "Jenkins is good, sir. Married his high school sweetheart, got 2 kids now, works for the VA in San Antonio, helping other wounded warriors navigate the system." Torres's voice carried the satisfaction of someone reporting good news about family, because that's what they'd become in the crucible of shared danger. Not just fellow soldiers, but brothers who'd earned the right to care about each other's futures. Behind Torres, other passengers had begun to realize they were witnessing something extraordinary. A woman in navy dress blues, who'd been traveling on orders, removed her cover and stood at attention. A young Marine in civilian clothes stepped forward, his bearing unmistakably military despite the lack of uniform. An Air Force pilot, still wearing his flight suit from a cross-country military transport mission, pushed through the crowd, recognition dawning on his face as he heard the conversation. By now, cell phones were appearing throughout the checkpoint, but not in the way that usually happened during airport incidents. These weren't people looking to capture drama or conflict for social media. These were passengers who recognized they were witnessing something rare and important, something that deserved to be remembered rather than exploited. The recording, that would later surface online, showed not a confrontation or a viral moment, but a quiet recognition between soldiers who'd shared the kind of experience that binds people together across decades and distance. Mitchell, the security supervisor, had gone pale as the implications of his comments became clear. The old man he'd been mocking wasn't just another difficult passenger. He was exactly the kind of person that airport security existed to protect. A decorated veteran who'd earned more respect in a single deployment than Mitchell would accumulate, in a lifetime of checking bags and waving people through metal detectors. The arrogance that had carried him through the first part of his shift evaporated like morning fog, replaced by the dawning realization that his career had probably just ended in the most public way possible. From near the gate area, a woman in a dark blue suit with a Department of Defense contractor badge had heard the commotion and was walking quickly toward the checkpoint. Linda Chen worked as a liaison between the Pentagon and civilian aviation authorities, responsible for ensuring that military personnel and veterans received appropriate assistance when traveling on official business. She'd heard David's name, mentioned over the security radio chatter, and recognized it immediately from clearance logs she'd processed for the Veterans Conference. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the authority that comes from actual credentials rather than borrowed. "Power. I'm Linda Chen, DoD contractor liaison for this facility. Colonel Weller is traveling on official business to a Pentagon-sponsored conference." She handed Mitchell a business card and a set of papers that made his hands shake slightly as he read them. "He's cleared through all necessary security protocols, and his participation in this conference has been personally requested by the Secretary of Veterans Affairs." Mitchell's supervisor had appeared from the back office, drawn by reports of a situation at Checkpoint 3 that involved military personnel and was being filmed by passengers. Frank Morrison had been managing airport security for 15 years and could recognize a public relations disaster when he saw one developing in real time. He'd dealt with veteran issues before, had received specific training about the sensitivities involved in screening former military personnel, and knew that this particular incident was exactly the kind of thing that ended up in congressional hearings and newspaper editorials. "Colonel Weller," Morrison said, approaching with the careful respect of someone who understood exactly how badly his employee had screwed up. "I apologize for any inconvenience our screening process may have caused. We have a private screening area available if you'd prefer to complete the process there, and I'd like to personally ensure that you and your son receive priority boarding assistance for your flight." David looked around the checkpoint, taking in the faces of the other passengers who were still watching, still listening, still recording. He could have made a scene, could have demanded apologies and explanations, and probably gotten Mitchell fired on the spot. Instead, he nodded once and said, "That would be appreciated, sir. Thank you." Because David Weller had never needed other people's anger to validate his own worth, had never required public humiliation of his enemies to feel victorious. The private screening took less than 5 minutes, conducted by Morrison himself, with the kind of professional courtesy that should have been standard from the beginning. David's cane was examined with appropriate care, his belongings handled with respect, his military ID processed without comment or question. When they emerged back into the main terminal, Torres was still waiting with a small group of other passengers who had served in Iraq or Afghanistan, men and women who recognized something in David's bearing that transcended age or physical limitation. "Sir," Torres said, "if you don't mind, some of us would like to buy you coffee before your flight. Nothing fancy, just—" He gestured around at the small group of veterans who had materialized from among the anonymous crowd of travelers. "Just want to say thank you properly. David looked at the faces surrounding him, young and old, male and female, representing different branches of service and different eras of conflict, but united by the understanding that some debts can never be fully repaid, only acknowledged with gratitude that transcends time and circumstance. "Coffee sounds good, Sergeant. Lead the way." The group moved together toward the terminal's main concourse, leaving behind a security checkpoint that had returned to its normal rhythm of routine processing and minor inconveniences. Mitchell was escorted to the security office by his supervisor. His shift ended and his employment status under immediate review. The other guards resumed their duties with a new understanding that every passenger carries stories they can't see, that assumptions based on appearance can transform routine interactions into moments of profound embarrassment or unexpected grace. At the coffee shop near Gate B7, David found himself surrounded by people who wanted nothing more than to sit in the presence of someone who had carried fire through hostile skies on their behalf. They didn't ask for war stories or dramatic details. They simply wanted to share space with a man who had answered the call when it mattered most, who had put his aircraft and his body between them and the people who wanted to kill them. The conversation that developed around the small cluster of tables was the kind that happens when people who understand each other's experiences gather without agenda or expectation. Torres sat directly across from David, still wearing the 3rd Infantry, division cap he'd removed so respectfully in the security line. Next to him sat Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, the Navy petty officer who'd stood at attention when she recognized what was happening. She'd served as a corpsman with Marine units in Afghanistan, had treated wounded soldiers in field hospitals, where Apache gunships provided overhead protection during medical evacuations. Her presence represented a different piece of the same puzzle, the ground-level perspective of someone who'd seen the results of David's work from the receiving end. The young Marine, who introduced himself as Lance Corporal James Washington, had served in Helmand Province during a deployment where Apache helicopters were the difference between successful patrols and body bags shipped home to families who'd never understand why their sons had to die in places they couldn't pronounce. He spoke quietly about watching helicopters work danger-close fire missions, how the sound of incoming Apaches meant that someone was going home alive who might not have otherwise. "You probably don't remember individual missions, sir," Washington said, his voice carrying the deference that young Marines show to senior officers they respect. "But there was this one day outside Musa Kala. We were taking fire from a compound we couldn't see, and this Apache came out of nowhere and put rockets right through the windows we couldn't even identify. Surgical precision, no collateral damage, just perfect flying." He paused, gathering his thoughts. Found out later that compound had been booby-trapped with explosives that would have killed civilians if we'd tried to assault it. That pilot saved lives on both sides. David listened, with the attention he'd always given to after-action reports, filing away details that might matter later, but he didn't claim credit for missions he couldn't verify, or battles that might have involved other pilots. "There were a lot of good aviators over there," he said simply. "Lot of people doing their jobs well when it mattered." The humility wasn't false modesty. It was the authentic response of someone who'd served in a system where individual heroics were less important than collective competence, where the mission mattered more than personal recognition. The Air Force. Pilot, Major Sarah Chen, had flown C-130 transport missions in the same airspace where David had operated his Apache. She'd seen the coordination required to keep attack helicopters supplied with fuel and ammunition, understood the logistical complexity of maintaining aviation operations in hostile territory where every supply run risked enemy contact. "People think flying helicopters is just individual skill," she said, addressing the group rather than David specifically. "They don't understand the teamwork, the communication, the split-second decisions that keep everyone alive. What you guys did over there, It wasn't just flying, it was leadership under pressure that most people can't even imagine. As the conversation continued, other travelers began to notice the small gathering of people in uniform and civilian clothes who were talking with unusual intensity. Near Gate B7, some recognized military bearing and moved on out of respect for what appeared to be a private gathering. Others paused to listen, drawn by the gravity of voices discussing experiences that civilian life rarely acknowledges. A few approached hesitantly, uncertain whether they were welcome, but wanting to express appreciation for service they didn't fully understand, but instinctively respected. When David's flight was called for boarding, the gate agent made an announcement that passengers in uniform or veterans would be invited to board first, a courtesy that David had never requested but accepted with the quiet grace he'd shown throughout the morning. As he walked down the jetway, leaning on his cane and moving at his own careful pace, he could hear Torres and the others still talking quietly among themselves, sharing their own stories now, connected by the understanding that they'd been part of something larger than themselves. Ethan helped his father settle into his seat, stowing the cane in the overhead compartment and making sure David had everything he needed for the flight to Phoenix. The morning's events had left him with a new understanding of his father's service, not just the abstract knowledge of deployments and medals, but the concrete reality of lives saved and dangers faced. "You know, Dad," he said quietly, "you could have told them who you were from the beginning, could have saved yourself all that hassle with that security guard." David looked out the window at the morning sun reflecting off the Potomac River, thinking about all the flights he'd taken over the years, all the times he'd lifted off from bases around the world, carrying other people's sons and daughters into danger and hopefully back home again. The river below reminded him of the Euphrates, which he'd crossed countless times during combat missions, and the Kabul River, which had served as a navigation reference during night flights in Afghanistan when GPS signals were unreliable and pilots navigated by landmarks that showed up on infrared displays as thermal signatures against the desert floor. "Son," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent thinking about the difference between respect earned and respect demanded. Respect that you have to demand isn't really respect at all. Sometimes it's better to let people show you who they are before you show them who you've been. He paused, watching ground crews service aircraft on the tarmac below, men and women whose jobs required the same attention to detail that had kept his Apache flying through sandstorms and enemy fire. "Besides," David continued, "that young man in the security line probably never had anyone teach him how to recognize service, how to show respect to people who've earned it. His problem wasn't meanness, it was ignorance, and ignorance can be fixed if people are willing to learn from their mistakes." The generosity in his assessment reflected the leadership philosophy he'd developed over 2 decades of military service. The understanding that correction was more valuable than punishment when someone was capable of growth. The Apache pilot had never sought attention, had never asked for recognition or special treatment or public acknowledgement of his service. He'd simply done his job, carried his burdens quietly, and accepted the physical limitations that came with age and injury, as part of the price he'd paid for a life of purpose. But that morning in the airport security checkpoint, one truth spoken by his son had shattered every assumption in that terminal, revealing that the man with the cane carried more than just the weight of years. He carried the wings of someone who had once danced with death in hostile skies and brought others home safely. The people who had once seen only an old man moving slowly discovered they were looking at a warrior who had earned the right to move at any pace he chose. Torres and the other veterans who'd gathered around him understood this instinctively, but the revelation had extended beyond the military community to include civilian travelers who'd witnessed the transformation from apparent weakness to revealed strength. They'd learned something fundamental about assumptions, about the danger of judging people based on surface appearances, about the heroes who walk among us every day without announcing themselves. In a world that too often mistakes noise for strength and speed for purpose, David Weller reminded everyone present that sometimes the quietest people have flown the loudest missions, and sometimes the slowest walkers have covered the most important ground. His service had been measured not in parades or publicity, but in lives saved and missions completed, in young soldiers who'd made it home to families they might never have seen again without the cover provided by an Apache pilot who understood that every bullet he drew toward his aircraft was one that wouldn't find a target on the ground. The lesson extended beyond military service to the broader question of how we recognize value in each other, how we distinguish between authority based on position and authority based on experience, how we show respect to people whose contributions might not be immediately visible, but are nonetheless real and significant. The security guard had confused his uniform with actual authority, his temporary power with permanent importance. David's quiet dignity had revealed the difference between demanding respect and earning it, between making noise and making a difference. If you believe that respect shouldn't require explanation, that heroes walk among us every day without announcing themselves, share this story with someone who needs to remember that greatness often limps quietly through airport terminals and grocery stores and suburban neighborhoods, asking for nothing more than the courtesy we should show to everyone. Drop a comment below if someone in your life quietly carries the weight of service without seeking recognition for it. And subscribe for more stories where courage doesn't always come with a parade, but always comes with honor earned in the places where it matters most.